Americans were shocked to learn that the government's intervention to save weak savings and loan institutions to pay insured depositors for funds lost and failed us and else would cost the taxpayers over $250 billion also. Disturbing was the idea that the federal budget deficits of over $250 billion a year added over $1 trillion to the nation's debt during the Bush presidency. Thousands of Republican voters felt betrayed when in 1990 Bush violated his campaign pledge of no new taxes. The unpopular tax law increased the top income tax rate to 31% and raised federal excise taxes on beer, wine, cigarettes, gasoline, and luxury cars and boats. Most damaging of all for Bush's re-election prospects was the recession starting in 1990 that ended the Reagan era of prosperity, increased unemployment, and decreased the average family income. President Bush began his administration calling for a kinder, gentler America and declaring himself the education president. He did sign into law the Americans with Disability Act in 1990, which prohibited discrimination against citizens with physical and mental disabilities and hiring all disabilities in hiring, transportation, and public accommodation. Outside of this accomplishment, the president offered little in the way of domestic policy in the midst of a recession. He emphasized cuts in federal programs. This seemed to offer little hope to growing numbers of Americans left behind by the Reagan Revolution. The Clinton years. During the last of the 20th century, the United States enjoyed a period of unrivaled economic growth and technological innovation. The end of the Cold War allowed Americans to focus more on economic and domestic issues. But during this period, American politics became more divided, bitter, and scandal-driven. A stagnant economy, huge budget deficits, and political deadlock fueled a growing disillusionment with the government, especially as practiced in the nation's capital. The movement to impose term limits on elected officials gained popularity on the state level, but the Supreme Court ruled that the United States Term Limits Incorporated versus Thornton in 1995 that the states could not limit the tenure of federal lawmakers without a constitutional amendment. Another reflection of America's disillusionment with Washington politics was the ratification in 1992 of the 27th Amendment, first proposed by James Madison in 1789. This amendment prohibited members of Congress from raising their own salaries. Future raises could not go into effect until the next session of Congress. As expected, George H. Bush was nominated by the Republicans for a second. After a long career in public service, the president seemed tired and out of touch with the average Americans who were more concerned about their paychecks than with Bush's foreign policy successes. Among Democrats, Bill Clinton, the youthful governor of Arkansas, emerged from the primaries as his party's choice for president. The first member of the baby boob generation to be nominated for president, Clinton proved an articulate and energetic campaigner. He presented himself as a moderate New Democrat who focused on economic issues such as jobs, education, and health care, which were important to the vital center of the electorate. The strategy was known among his political advisors as "It's the economy, stupid." Ross Perot, a Texas millionaire, entered the 1992 race for president as an independent. Able to use his own resources to finance a series of TV commercials, Perot appealed to millions of his anti-Washington, anti-deficit views on Election Day. Perot captured nearly 20% of the popular vote for the best third-party showing since Theodore Roosevelt and the Bull Moose campaign of 1912. Despite the serious challenge from Perot, the front-runner still divided up all the electoral votes, 374. Clinton and 43% of the popular vote, a 168 for Bush, 37% of the popular vote Clinton, and his running mate Senator Albert Gore of Tennessee did well in the South and recaptured the majority of the elderly and blue-collar workers from the Republicans. In addition, the Democrats won again control of both houses of Congress. The new Congress better reflected the diversity of the United States population. Among its 66 minority members and 48 women was Carol Moseley Brown of Illinois, the first African American woman to be elected to the Senate. The early years of Bill Clinton's presidency were marked by controversies over his cabinet nominations, his failed effort to lift the ban on homosexuals in the military scandals in the White House travel office, and his connection to the failed White House real estate deal in Arkansas. During the first 2 years of the Clinton administration, the Republicans, by filibustering in the Senate, were able to kill the president's economic stimulus package, campaign finance reform, environmental bills, and health care reform. The president's use of his wife Hillary Rodham Clinton as the chief architect of his program for universal health coverage backfired. The Clintons' complicated proposal for managed health care ran into determined opposition from the insurance industry and small business organizations. By the end of 1994, the Republicans had managed to stop all the Democrats' proposals for health care reform. The Democratic Congress started out 1993 by passing the Family and Medical Leave Act and the Motor Voter Law that enabled citizens to register to vote as they received their driver's licenses. The Liberty Handgun Bill, which mandated a 5-day waiting period for the purchase of handguns, was enacted. In 1994, the Congress enacted Clinton's anti-crime bill, which provided $30 billion in funding for more police protection and crime prevention programs. The legislation also banned the sale of most assault weapons, which angered the gun lobby. After protracted negotiation and compromise, Congress passed a deficit reduction budget that included a $255 billion in spending cuts and $241 billion in tax increases. Incorporated in this budget were the president's request for increased appropriations for education and job training. Clinton also won a notable victory by signing the North American Free Trade Agreement, (NAFTA), which created a free trade zone with Canada, Mexico. Despite these accomplishments, Clinton's apparent waffling on policies and eagerness to compromise seemed to confirm his negative image as Slick Willie in the midterm elections of November 1990. For the Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress for the first time since 1954. They benefited from the perception that the Democratic Congress was inept and dedicated to increasing taxes and federal regulations. President Clinton adjusted to his party's defeat by declaring in his 1995 State of the Union address that the era of big government is over. Newt Gingrich, the newly elected Speaker of the House, led the Republicans in an attack on federal programs and spending outlined in their campaign manifesto contract with America. While the president and moderates agreed with the goal of the balanced budget, Clinton proposed a leaner, not meaner budget. The confrontation resulted into shutdowns of the federal government in late 1995, which many Americans blamed on an overzealous Congress. Anti-government reformers were not helped by the mood after the bombing in the 1995 of a federal building in Oklahoma City by militia government extremists. The bombing took 169 lives, the worst act of terrorism in the nation's history until the attacks on September 11, 2001. Finally, in the 1996 election year, Congress and the president compromised on a budget that left Medicare and Social Security benefits intact, limited welfare benefits to 5 years under the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, set some curves on immigrants, increased the minimum wage, and balanced the budget. The spending cuts and tax increases made dairy accent increases made during Clinton's first term, along with record growth, and the economy helped to eliminate the deficit, and the federal spending in 1998 produced the first federal surplus since 1969. In his battle with the Republican Congress, President Clinton captured the middle ground by successfully characterizing the Republicans as extremist and by taking over their more popular positions, such as balancing the budget and reforming welfare. He was also aided in the 1996 election by a fast-growing economy that had produced over 10 million new jobs. Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, the majority leader of the Senate, became Clinton's Republican opponent. His campaign, which proposed a 15% tax cut, never captured the voter. Character attacks and massive campaign spending by both sides did little to bring more people to the polls, and the turnout dropped below 50% of eligible voters. The Clinton-Gore ticket won with 379 electoral votes. That's 49.2% of the popular vote, while Dole and his running mate Jack Kemp captured a 159 electoral votes, 40.8% of the popular vote. Ross-Perot ran again, but had little impact on the election. President Clinton became the first Democrat since Franklin Roosevelt to be re-elected president. The Republicans could celebrate retaining control of both houses of Congress, which they had not done since the 1920s. During President Clinton's second term, 1997 to 2001, the United States enjoyed the longest peacetime economic expansion in its history, with annual growth rates of over 4%. Technological innovations and computers, the Internet and wireless communications fueled increased national productivity, a gift's no productivity, a gain of over 5% in 1999, and media or electronic commerce is part of American life. After years of heavy competition with Europe and Asia, American businesses have become proficient in cutting costs, which both increased their profitability and held down the United States inflation rate to 2 to 3% a year. Investors were rewarded with record gains in the stock market, over a 22% average annual gains, and Standard & Poor index of 500 leading stocks. The number of households worth 1 million or more quadrupled in the 1990s to 8 million or is million, or 1 in 14 households. The unemployment rate fell from 7.5% in 1990 to a 30-year low of 3.9% 2000, and the unemployment of African Americans and Hispanic was the lowest on record. During the peak of prosperity from 1997 to 1999, average and lower-income Americans experienced the first gains in real income since 1973. However, the economic boom was over by 2001, and both investors and wage earners face another recession. The prosperity of the late 1990s shifted the debate in Washington to what to do with federal government surplus. Revenues projected to be $4.6 trillion over the first 10 years of the 21st century. In 1997, Congress and the president did compromise on legislation that cut taxes on estates and capital gains and gave tax credits for families with children and for higher education expenses. As Clinton's second term progressed, the struggle between the Democratic president and the Republican Congress intensified. The Republican pressed for more tax revenue cuts, such as the elimination of the death tax and the marriage penalty, while the president held out for using the projected surplus to support Social Security, expand Medicare, and reduce the national debt. From the early days of the Clinton presidency, President Clinton, his wife Hillary, cabinet members, and other associates had been under investigation by Congress and by congressionally appointed independent prosecutors. Dictators. Some Democrats view these investigations as a right-wing conspiracy to overturn the elections of 1992 and 1996. After long and expensive investigations, the Clintons were not charged with illegalities in the Whitewater real estate deal, the firings of the White House staff, Travelgate, or the political use of FBI files. Filegate. However, independent prosecutor Kenneth Starr charged that President Clinton, during his deposition in a civil suit about alleged sexual harassment while governor of Arkansas, had lied about his relations with a young woman who had served as a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. In December 1998, the White House voted to impeach the president on 2 counts: perjury and obstruction of justice. Members of both parties and the public condemned Clinton's reckless personal behavior, but popular opinion did not support the largely Republican attempt to remove him from office. In the fall elections, Democrats gained House seats, and Newt Gingrich resent this feats a new geography, signed as Speaker. In February 1999, after a formal trial in the Senate, neither impeachment charge was upheld, even by a Senate majority, even less than 2/3 vote needed to remove a president from office. However, the Republicans damaged Clinton's reputation by making him the first president to be impeached since 1868. A weary Congress in 2000 allowed the controversial law establishing the Independent Prosecutor's Office to lapse. In the end of the Cold War, while taking away the Soviet threat exposes dozens of long-standing ethnic, religious, and cultural conflicts in the world of 190 nations. During Clinton's first-term Secretary of State, Warren Christopher conducted a low-key foreign policy which critics thought lacked coherent purpose. In 1997, Madeleine K. Albright became the first woman to serve as Secretary of State. She proved more assertive in the use of American power, but questions still remained about the role of the United States, especially the use of its armed forces for peacekeeping in foreign nations' internal conflicts. The first deaths of United States soldiers and humanitarian missions during the Clinton administration came in the Civil War in Somalia in 1993. In 1994, after some reluctance, the president sent 20,000 troops into Haiti to restore its elected president Jean-Bertrand Aristide after a military coup. And deteriorating economic conditions had caused an exodus of Haitians to Florida. The United States also played a key diplomatic role in negotiating an end to British rule and the armed conflict in Northern Ireland in 1998. Under President Boris Yeltsin, and Russia struggled with attempted economic reforms in rampant corruption. In 2000, his elected successor Vladimir Putin had to deal with the physical breakdown of systems such as Russia's space station and the accidental sinking of a nuclear submarine which killed all on board. Relations with the United States were strained by Russia's brutal repression of the civil war in Chechnya, admittance in the 1999 of Czech Republic, Hungarian Holland tornado, and by Russia's support of Serbia in the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. In the latter, Siberian dictator Slobodan Milosevic carried out a series of armed conflicts to suppress independence movements in the former Yugoslav provinces of Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo. Hundreds of thousands of members of ethnic and religious minorities were killed in the process that was labeled ethnic cleansing, a combination of diplomacy, bombing, and troops from NATO countries, including the United States, stopped the bloodshed, first in Bosnia in 1995 and again in Kosovo 1999. The Serbian people themselves removed Milosevic from power in the 2000 election, and an international tribunal tried him for a crime of genocide. These Balkan Wars proved to be the worst conflict in Europe had seen since World War II and were a troubling reminder of how World War I had started. Nuclear proliferation became a growing concern in the 1990s when North Korea stepped up its nuclear reactor and missile programs, and India and Pakistan tested nuclear weapons for the first time in 1998. North Korea agreed to halt the development of nuclear weapons after direct negotiations with the Clinton administration, but later secretly restarted the program in 1995, 20 years after the fall of the Saigon. To the communists, the United States established diplomatic relations with Vietnam. The Clinton administration continued to sign trade agreements with China through his second term, hoping to improve diplomatic relations and encourage reform within China despite protest from human rights activists and labor unions at home and Chinese threats to the still independent island nation of Taiwan. Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein's continued defiance of the United Nations weapons inspectors led to the suspension of all inspections. In 1998, President Clinton responded with a series of airstrikes against Iraq, but Hussein remained in power as support for the United States economic sanctions declined, and Europe in the Middle East. The United States continued to assist the Israeli-Palestine peace process, which resulted in the return of home rule to the Palestinians and the Gaza Strip and parts of the West Bank territories, and the signing of a peace treaty with King Hussein of Jordan in 1994. The peace process slowed after the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and it broke down late in 2000 over issues of Israeli security and control of Jerusalem. renewed violence, and Israel also provoked a new round of anti-American sentiment in the Islamic world. The surging increase in trade communications and the government of capital around the world during this era were key parts of the process of globalization. Globalization promoted the development of global and regional economic organizations. The World Trade Organization was established in 1994 to oversee trade agreements, enforce trade rules, and settle disputes. The powerful International Monetary Fund and the World Bank made loans to and supervised the economic policies of power nations with debt troubles. The European Union became a unified market of 15 nations, 12 of which adopted a single currency, the euro, and 2000 to the EU. Planned to grow to 25 European nations and promised to become an economic superpower of the 21st century. The Group of Seven G7, the world's largest industrial powers, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom in the United States, which control 2/3 of the world's wealth, remain the leading economic powers, but China and India enjoyed rapid development. The growing gap between the rich and the poor nations of the world caused tensions, especially over the debts the poor nations owed to powerful banks, and the richest nations' workers and unions in the richest nations often resented globalization, however, because they lost their jobs to cheaper labor markets in the developing world. According to the 2000 census, the resident population of the United States was 281.4 million, making it the third most populous nation in the world. The 32.7 million person increase since 1990 represented a growth rate of 13.2% over the decade. The fastest growing regions of the United States in the 1990s continued to be centered in the West, 19.7%, and in the South, 17.3%, while slower growth took place in the Midwest, 7.9%, in the Northeast, 5.9%. The South, the most populous region with over 100 million people in the West, would continue to enjoy the shift of congressional representatives and electoral votes to their regions, which had helped to make them centers of political power. The 2000 census reported that more than 80% of the United States residents lived in the nation's 280 metropolitan areas, which included cities and their surrounding suburbs. In the 2000 census, Americans could identify their origins by 2 or more races for the first time, which 6.8 million people did. The white-only population, while growing in numbers, continued to decline as percentage of the population from 87.5% in 1970 to 75.1% in 2000. This was largely a result of lower birth rates and shifts and sources of immigration. The percentage of black-only population was 12.3 in 2000, up from 11.1 in 1970. However, the Hispanic population, whose origins may be of any race, was the fastest growing segment of the population. In 2000, for the first time, Hispanics emerged as the largest minority group in the nation, with 12.5% of the United States population. Asian Americans also represented another fast-growing part of society, with the population of over 10 million. By 2000, 10.4% of the population was foreign-born, in the largest percentage since 1930 census, but well below the levels of foreign-born population and the United States had in the 1870s through the 1920s. Immigration accounted for 27.8% of the population increase in the 1990s and was a key stimulus to the economic growth. During the decade without immigration, it is predicted that the United States could experience a negative population growth by 2030. As the United States becomes more ethnically diverse, the population is also growing with a steady increase of life expectancy. By 2030, 5 million people were over 65 years old, but the fastest growing segment of the population was those 85 and over. As the baby boom generation ages, there is growing concern about healthcare, prescription drugs, senior housing, and Social Security. It is estimated that in 2030 that there will be only about 2 workers for every person receiving Social Security. The decline of the traditional family and the growing Number of single-parent family homes had become another national concern. The number of families headed by a female with no husband soared from 5.5 million, 10.5 million, 10.7% to 17.6% in 2000. Single women headed an alarming 47.2% of Black families in 2000, but the same trend was all evident in white and Hispanic households with children under 18 years old. Children and these families often grew up in poverty and without adequate support. In many ways, Americans were achieving the American dream. Homeownership continued to climb during the prosperity of the 1990s to 67.4% of all households, up from 60.9% in 1970. Per capita money income was constant. Inflation-adjusted dollars rose dramatically from $12,000 to $175 1970 to $22,199 2000. However, the distribution of income varied widely by race, gender, and education. For example, the median income in 2000 was $53,000 to $156 for white families and $35,054 for Hispanic families and $34,192 for Black families. High school graduates earned only half the income of their college-educated counterparts. Even more pronounced was growing concentration of wealth among the richest Americans. In 1999, the top fifth of American households earned over half of all the income, up from 44% in 1977. All other categories saw their share of income decline. The average after-tax income actually declined between 1977 and 1997 for the lowest 3/5 of households. The United States entered the 21st century as the richest country in the world, but all of the leading industrialized nations, it also had the largest gap between lowest and highest paid workers and the greatest concentration of wealth among the top earning households. Some critics of the change called it the New Gilded Age.